than human.
You can watch this and other programs online at booktv.org.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome. If you would please make your way to your seats. We are ready to begin. So hello, everybody, and welcome to Temple Emanuel of Beverly Hills, to our second Barent Conversation of the year. I am Rabbi Sarah Bassin, and we are delighted to be partnering with Chevalier's books in order to be bringing Dr. Reza Aslan to speak about his newest book, God, A Human History. But before we bring out Dr. Aslan, I want to give you a little bit of context about what the Barent Conversation series is here at Temple Emanuel. We started this program last year in response to how our civic fabric has been tearing, to the idea that it has become harder and harder for us to have conversations with people when we disagree, especially on issues that are important to us. So we were very lucky to have the Barent family come forward and to help us formulate this conversation series. Larry Barent, his wife Stephanie Hammer, and his sister Judy Barent, all of whom have been significant thought partners in helping us shape this event. We are very lucky to have them and to have events like these. So you might be wondering what it is that a conversation about God has to do with difficult conversations. And what I'll say is this, that I think that Jews are good at a lot of things, but one of them is not necessarily our ability to talk about God, right? We don't often talk about what we do believe. We don't talk about what we don't believe. And I would even go as far as to say that a lot of us are probably pretty happy that our prayers are in Hebrew so that we don't have to think too hard about what it is that we're actually saying about God when we pray. And I think it's because the whole idea of God is deeply personal, what we believe and what we don't. And it feels vulnerable when we actually have conversations about those deeply held beliefs. But I want us to try. So before we bring out Dr. Aslan, I want us to take 30 seconds to think of a moment in our own lives, in your life, when you have had a kind of spiritual or transformative experience. You may or may not use the language of God, right? You may reject that that has anything to do with God, that that's not the language that speaks to you, and that's fine. But I want you to think of a moment of purpose or connectedness that you've experienced in your life, because I'm going to ask you to share that moment with somebody who's sitting next to you. So take 30 seconds to think in silence. And when you're ready, make eye contact with somebody sitting next to you, maybe somebody you know or somebody you don't. And take 30 seconds for each of you to share that experience. If you haven't switched for the other person to speak, switch now. And go ahead and finish your thought with this sentence or the next sentence. And focus your attention back up here. Because I would imagine that maybe that felt like a little bit of a risk, right? Maybe that felt a little uncomfortable and perhaps even a little difficult. But we are incredibly lucky that over the next hour and a half, we are going to be guided through this difficult conversation by an extraordinary person, Dr. Reza Aslan. Dr. Aslan is an internationally renowned writer, scholar, producer, commentator, and his #1 bestseller book last year called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, caused a lot of conversation in the public sphere about religion. It was translated in over a dozen languages around the world. He is a recipient of the prestigious James Joyce Award. He serves as a professor of creative writing at UC Riverside and holds a PhD in the sociology of religion from UC Santa Barbara. Personally, I am a fan of the work that he has done through BoomGen Studios, which is a production company focused largely on content and topics about the Middle East. One of my favorite documentaries was produced by BoomGen Studios. It's called The Square. If you saw it on Netflix, about the early stages of the Arab Spring. Needless to say, Reza Aslan is one of the most prolific and important voices on religion in the public sphere in our time today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Reza Aslan.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
So we are so delighted to have you here today.
What a joy it is to be here. You know, I drive by this temple all the time.
Really?
And it's one of the few temples in LA that I've never actually been inside of.
Well,
so it's nice to be here.
We are delighted to officially welcome you.
Yeah.
You and I are going to talk for about 45 minutes,
okay.
And then for those of you who are interested in asking Dr. Aslan a question, you've got cards on your chairs and pencils. So throughout the program, we'll have people coming through to pick up those cards and filter them up to me.
Also, you can call me Reza. I feel like Dr. Aslan. The problem is that I'm like the useless kind of doctor. You know, like the doctor that can't help anyone. And so, like, every time someone says Dr. Aslan, I get nervous that what if something goes wrong? And people ask me for help, and I'm no help.
That's fair. It's probably appropriate to start on a first-name basis because I'm going to be asking you some very personal questions.
I'm ready.
The first of which is that you start off this book discussing your own personal religious journey in your life. And it's a really interesting and non-linear journey. And I think it gives some good context about why you wrote the book. So would you mind sharing, just with this intimate audience,
Sure.
a little bit about your religious experience?
Yeah. So I was born in Iran. My family was, culturally Muslim, the way so many people are culturally religious. With the exception of my father. My father was always just like devout atheist, one of those atheists who always had a pocket full of Prophet Muhammad jokes that he would pull out at inappropriate times, like that kind of atheist, And so when the revolution happened, I think my father basically thought maybe we should get out for a little while, lay low until things settle down. Obviously, they did not settle down. That was 40 years ago. And when we came to the United States, this was, of course, 1979, 1980. It was at the height of the Iran hostage crisis. So it was not exactly the best time to be either Iranian or Muslim in America, as opposed to now when it's fantastic. Everything's great now. I think that kind of pushed us to just sort of strip our lives clean of religion at all. We certainly of Islam. My mom would occasionally pray, and sometimes we would do some of the cultures and the holidays. But for the most part, back then, being Muslim was like being from Mars. In fact, I've admitted on numerous occasions that I spent like a good part of the 1980s pretending to be Mexican, which tells you how little I understood America. Because, it didn't help at all. But I think that there was something about my childhood experience of revolutionary Iran that left this lasting impression on me, and particularly about the power that religion has to transform a society, for good and for bad. And despite the fact that I grew up in a fairly non-religious household, I was always fascinated by religion and by spirituality and mythologies, and I was looking for a way to kind of express that. When I was 15, I went with some friends to what turned out to be an evangelical youth camp. And
did you know that at the time?
I knew that it was a youth camp, and I knew that it was Christian, but I didn't really know what any of that meant, to be honest with you. And when that was essentially where I first heard the gospel story, and this incredible story about how the God of heaven and earth became a baby, and he died for our sins, and that anybody who believes in him will also never die and will live forever. And I'd never heard anything like that before in my life. It was a transformative moment for me, and I immediately converted to this very conservative evangelical brand of Christianity, and then spent the next 4, 5, 6 years preaching that gospel to everyone.
Your family included?
Yeah, whether they wanted to hear it or not, frankly. It was like, and my family, and I converted my mother, and who's still a devout, faithful Christian. And then I went to college, and I decided that I was going to study religion for a living. I've always wanted to be a writer. I mean, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I don't remember ever wanting to be anything else. Like, there was never an other option for me. But I'm also an immigrant. And when you're an immigrant, you can't tell your parents that you're going to be a writer. Like, that doesn't, it doesn't compute. In fact, I remember this one conversation I had with my mom, and only one conversation, in which I said, "Mom, I think what I want to do is I want to be a writer." And her response was, "Who's stopping you from writing? You go and be a doctor, and then you write. Nobody's stopping you." And so I thought, okay, well, I'll be an academic who also writes. That seems.
And you still get the title of doctor.
Yeah, exactly. I still get to call myself a doctor. My mom milks that.
Yeah.
And look, I had the experience that pretty much everybody has when they go to college, right? When you suddenly realize that everything you thought you knew was wrong, right? Like, every assumption you ever had, pretty much everything you had learned up to that moment was wrong. And this it blew my mind. And I abandoned Christianity, but I still was looking for some way of continuing to study religion, but also having a spiritual life. And it was actually the Jesuits at my university. I went to Santa Clara University, and if you know the Jesuits, they're troublemakers, all right? They are troublemakers. It was the Jesuits who basically said, well, why don't you, you grew up Muslim, why don't you explore that? And I knew nothing, nothing about Islam at all. And so I began to study Islam, and I especially began to really delve into the way in which Islam defines God, which is the opposite way of the way that Christianity defines God. It's very much the way Judaism defines God. Christianity essentially says that if you want to know what God is, imagine the most perfect human being that's God. And that just stopped working for me after a while. And what I was looking for was a different metaphor. And the metaphor that I found, particularly in the Sufi tradition of Islam, was this concept of divine unity. This notion that, look, if there is a God, and if that God is one, and if that God is indivisible, then everything is God. Then there can't be any separation between creator and creation. And I thought, yes, that works for me. And so I often say that I had an emotional conversion to Christianity, and then I had like an intellectual conversion to Islam. But I do want to say something I think that's very important, and I feel like I should just get it out at the beginning because it always comes up anyway. When you study the religions of the world, it becomes very difficult to take any one of those religions all that seriously. Certainly, it becomes very difficult to take the truth claims of any one of those religions that seriously, because it doesn't take long to realize that these are essentially different languages for the same emotion, for the same sentiment. And what I'm interested in is the emotion. What I'm interested in is the sentiment. Certainly, I have my own ways of expressing that sentiment, but how one expresses it to me is irrelevant.
So you walk this really interesting line of being both a believer and of being a scholar of religions.
Yeah.
And, I'll confess my own bias. When I pick up a book titled God, I'm expecting one of two things, right? I'm expecting either a religious apologist who is telling me why and how I should believe in God, or I'm expecting a new atheist who's telling me that
it's all ridiculous.
It's all baloney and it's absolutely ridiculous, and here's why you should reject God, right? You have this really interesting quote at the beginning that, it says, "I have no interest in trying to prove the existence or non-existence of God. Faith is a choice, and anyone who says otherwise is trying to convert you."
Yeah.
I love that.
That's about right. Yeah.
But what was it like for you of walking this line as a believer and as a scholar? And did you feel yourself getting pulled?
Yeah. And by the way, I should mention that is actually unusual in the field of religious studies. Most people go into the academic field of religion, those who aren't going there in order to become ministers of one sort or another, those who are going in there just for the academic discipline. Most people who enter the field of religious studies do so from a religious background. It's rare that somebody who had no religious instruction at all decides, I'm going to spend my life studying the religions of the world. That doesn't happen that often. I think for those of us who do, often we come at it from a particular perspective. That's how we enter it. And then when you start studying religion, either religions or any particular religion, from a historical and literary and cultural and sociological perspective, an anthropological perspective, rather than from a theological perspective, which is usually how you were introduced to that religion, as a set of doctrines, as a set of beliefs. Often what happens is that your personal faith starts to crumble. And it crumbles because so often, and this is true, by the way, of most people who identify with a religion, regardless of what religion we're talking about, most people, their faith is in that religion, not in what the religion points them to. And so when cracks or fissures start to appear, particularly in the truth claims of that religion, the whole edifice crumbles. Like, I often think to myself, had I converted to, a more sort of liberal or progressive Christianity, I probably would still be a Christian today. But I converted to a brand of Christianity that is predicated on the inerrancy and literalness of the Bible. Like, that's the foundation of, fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, that the Bible is literally true and it is absolutely without errors. It takes about 5 minutes to realize that the Bible is full of errors. As it should be when you're considering, a text that was compiled by dozens of different hands over hundreds of years. And those errors don't in any way diminish the divine value of the text, not at all. And it's ludicrous to think that the truth claims of the scripture are predicated on whether its facts are correct or not. But that's the religion that I was told, that I was fed. And so when I discovered that was incorrect, the whole thing crumbled because my faith wasn't in God. My faith was in just this religion.
So there are almost 100 plus people in this room who are walking away with a copy of this book tonight that you have spent so much time writing.
Bedtime reading.
Without taking away the rationale for us reading it. Can you walk us through a little bit of this trajectory of the evolution of the human experience of God, and particularly this dichotomy that you point out between the dehumanized notion of God and the humanized notion of God?
Yeah. So, the basic argument of the book is that you can look at the entirety of human spirituality, going all the way back, deep into our evolutionary past, to the very origins of the religious experience, up to today. You can look at that entire process as one long, intimately connected, ever-evolving, and remarkably cohesive attempt to make sense of the divine by humanizing the divine, by implanting in the divine human personalities, human motivations, human emotions, human weaknesses and strengths, virtues and vices, by essentially transforming God into a human, until, of course, in the person of Jesus Christ, he becomes literally a human being. And what's fascinating about that is that it's kind of a function of our brains, that, believe it or not, we don't have much choice in the matter. It's a cognitive impulse. We do it without actually thinking about it. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether you believe in God or not. That's the really cool part about it. Atheists do this as much as believers do. And in fact, when you tell an atheist, okay, well, fine, you don't believe in God. Now describe what you mean by God.
It's interesting. Rabbi Aaron, the senior rabbi here at the congregation, he always says to people, I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in.
Yeah.
Right?
And honestly, that's such an important, because this question of does God exist, or do you believe in God or not, we all assume that we mean the same thing by God. It's so funny how we don't actually bother to think about the fact that this word that is probably the most variable word in all language, is one that we just simply assume, well, obviously you mean the same thing that I mean by God. So even with atheists, they do this thing. And we can talk about the reasons why we do it. We can certainly have a conversation about, what it is in the human mind that compels us to do that and why. And we can also talk, I think, at length about what to do about it. I'd love to have those conversations. But I do want to emphasize one thing, which is this is not a good thing. It's not actually a positive thing to humanize God. Because while it's true, what it does do when you construct a God who looks and feels and acts and thinks just like you do, it allows you to have a relationship, to actually commune with that divine that you have constructed as essentially a divine version of yourself. But what it also does is that it infuses that divine with your biases and your bigotries and your prejudices. Basically, what you do is you create a God who becomes nothing more than a mirror reflecting back to you your own ideas, the things that you love and the things that you hate. And that is extraordinarily dangerous.
I really loved that little promo video that you did, right? That piece where you said, God doesn't hate gay people. You hate gay people, right? God doesn't love America. You love America.
Yeah, exactly. And it's And it's what I think is fascinating about it is that, look, religion has done a lot of good in the world, and it's done a lot of bad in the world. And I think that there's, this dichotomy, this sort of conversation that we have all the time that, people say, no, religion is a good thing. No, religion is a bad thing. First of all, religion is both those things. And the reason it's both those things is because they are nothing more than a reflection of everything that's good about or bad about us. We construct a God who is a divine version of ourselves, and then we construct a religion based on that God that we constructed, which is just a construction of ourselves. And then we wonder why our religious institutions are so flawed. Well, they're so flawed because they are human inventions. And I think, what I'd like to do is at the very least, start getting people to be aware of that cognitive impulse and to figure out whether that's something that they want to change or not.
This is where I think that your use of the metaphor language is really effective, right? Like, if you think about religion as a tool, as a language,
right,
then language can be used for good, right? Language can be used for evil, but language is a necessity. It's like it's an expression of what it is to be human. You're not going to get rid of language, right?
Right.
So we have to grapple with religion as though it were a language and try to pull it towards the good rather than towards the bad.
That's perfectly said. Yeah, I mean, I preach this constantly. Don't confuse faith with religion. They are not the same thing. Faith, as we've been talking about all this time, is, it's ineffable. It's mysterious. It's individual. It's not a rational thing. It's an experiential thing. It's an emotion. I think that's the best way for me to describe what faith is. It's an emotion like any other emotion. And our emotions are not rational things. Our emotions are based on our experiences, our connections with each other, who we are, how we define ourselves. Emotions are mysterious things. But we need a way to express what is fundamentally an inexpressible experience. We need a language, a set of symbols, a set of metaphors that we can communicate those feelings to ourselves and to like-minded people. And there are, throughout the world, a set of ready-made languages already. And you can, if you so choose, you don't have to, but if you so choose, find one of those languages that resonates with you and use it to communicate this experience, to draw connections, with other people who have the same emotion.
So let's keep on this idea of kind of emotionality around religion. Your last book, Zealot, about the life of Jesus of Nazareth, it ruffled a few feathers.
You think?
Some in the Christian community, right, had the critique that what is a Muslim doing writing a book about Jesus, of course ignoring the fact that Jesus has a role to play in Islam as well. Some took issue with how you interpreted the sources and the evidence from the era, but I think just kind of contextualizing that reaction, it really is about this sensitivity that religion has. And when people start poking at it, it can get very upsetting.
Yeah.
So with this book, have you happened upon any sensitivities that have been surprising, or have there been points of interest that people have really emotionally connected to?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We're about 4 years removed from Zealot, and so I feel like I've had enough time to kind of process the response and really, this is what I do. I'm an academic, so I want to analyze it and create, data that I can sift through and make certain conclusions about. And one of those conclusions is that the negative response to the book didn't actually come from Christians. Not even conservative Christians, actually. Part of the reason why it was such a big bestseller was because many Christians bought it. They discussed it in their churches and had these interesting conversations about it. The negative reaction came from one particular group of Christians, and that was right-wing Christians. And who in many ways have the same theology as mainstream Christians, but who have a different politics. And I think this is important to understand, not just because of the context about what happened with the book, but I think it helps us understand exactly what's going on right now in American Christianity. Because the issue that people seem to have was about Jesus's politics. That they had a very difficult time recognizing Jesus as, a poor Jewish peasant from the backwoods of Galilee whose entire message was predicated not on equality, on the contrary, but on the reversal of the social order. Jesus didn't say the rich and the poor shall come together and hold hands. He said the rich and the poor will switch places. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. That those who are wealthy now will become poor. That those who are fed will become hungry. That those who rejoice will weep. And this was an extraordinarily radical, revolutionary idea in Jesus' time, and it still is today. The problem is that Jesus has been, defanged by, I think, most modern, particularly American Christians, who would rather think of Jesus as, a middle-class business owner who really hated taxes, right? Like that's Jesus, That's literally Bill O'Reilly's Jesus book, by the way. I'm not making that up. That's literally his book. And I think that to me was really fascinating to see that. And of course, now 4 years later, we're seeing precisely the political division within American Christianity exert itself in the Trump phenomenon, and now with Roy Moore in Alabama being openly, defended by Christians who are, shrugging off pedophilia, And it's extraordinary, but I got a glimpse of that, I think, 4 years ago. Yeah. And then I think for, a large part of why people respond the way they tend to respond to my books is not because I'm courting controversy. I promise you I'm not courting controversy. I'm not avoiding controversy, but I'm not courting controversy. It's for the exact reason that you said, that I think we have to understand that religion, regardless of what religion you're talking about, regardless where in the world you are talking about, religion is often far more a matter of identity than it is a matter of beliefs and practices. That's not to say that beliefs and practices don't matter. Of course they do. But when someone says, I'm a Jew, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Buddhist, they are making first and foremost an identity statement. It's a statement about who they are, how they understand their place in the world, how they define their relationship with other people. It's not just, these are the things I do and these are the things that I believe. And so when someone feels as though some aspect of their religion is being criticized, even from a historical perspective, without any negative intention, then what they're really reacting to is the fact that they feel that their very identity is suddenly under siege. So it's not just, hey, maybe Jesus didn't really want you to drive a really nice car. Instead of arguing about the text or theology, what I think some people feel as though is that I am actually attacking who they are as human beings. But it comes with the territory. And strangely, I kind of mentioned this backstage, I haven't really had that with this yet. Now, it's only been 2 weeks. It's plenty of time. Okay? I don't know how this is going to go. So it could deteriorate really quickly. But so far, I think it's because, when I start telling people what the book's about, usually what happens is people start to go, yeah, like that. Yeah, I guess I do that. And I guess that is a thing. And so right away, I think it takes people, it takes them off guard a little bit.
So, in seeing how this is going to go, you do all have note cards that you can write your questions on, and we'll have folks who are starting to go around and gather some of those note cards. So please do take a moment. We've only got a few more minutes where Reza and I are going to be in conversation just ourselves before we loop you in. So, the chunk in the middle, you've described a little bit about this humanized versus dehumanized part of perspective on God. Then towards the end, you bring back in your own faith experience, right? And you talk about how you arrived at a pantheistic notion of God through Sufism, right? Through Sufi tradition within Islam. So I'm going to want you to explain a little bit about what pantheism is.
Okay, sure.
And you rightfully point out that there are threads of this that are in all other religious traditions.
Religions, yeah.
Judaism included.
Including Judaism, that's right.
So I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to speak a little bit about the Kabbalistic tradition of Tzimtzum.
Let's do it.
To tie it into yours.
Sure. Yes. So at the end of the book, I essentially make, a kind of full-throated argument for a more pantheistic view of God, a God that is dehumanized, a God that is not a divine personality who looks and acts like we do, but a God who is essentially the animating force of the entire universe. And I do talk about how this was, the whole first, 3 chapters are all about, prehistoric conceptions of the divine. And I make an argument about how that's actually the original way in which the idea of God was understood as the force of the universe, the creative force of the universe itself. And in our modern parlance, we have a term for that. It's called pantheism. It's a new word, but it's an old idea. Pantheism is a Greek word that just basically means all is God and God is all. It's the belief, as I was describing earlier, that there can be no division between creator and creation, that they are fundamentally the same thing. And that what we think of as the universe is nothing more than the self-expression of the divine. So first I should say that part of the reason that I make this argument is, first and foremost, I think it provides a deeper spirituality, in my view, a deeper, more meaningful spiritual connection than thinking of God in these, personality terms. Secondly, because I think that it's a kind of spirituality that can lead to greater, connections between different religions and between different peoples. And I think it could lead to actually a better world. If you see God in every human being, if every human being is God, then it becomes, impossible to denigrate or devalue human beings because those human beings are God. You can't abuse or exploit nature because nature is God. It's I think a recipe for a deeper and more peaceful and more forward-looking spirituality. And yes, it exists in all religions, and it exists in a very strong form, obviously, in the Kabbalistic formula, particularly as it was evolved by the great Isaac Luria, and the Lurianic Kabbalah, as it's often known. Why am I telling you this? You all know this.
We might not all know it. So help us out.
So the notion of tzimtzum is that, again, it starts with this fundamental problem at the heart of monotheism. I should mention monotheism is a very new idea, right? In the hundreds of thousands of years in which we can trace human spirituality, the concept that there is only one God is barely 3,000 years old. Barely. And by the way, I know this is a tangent, but I should say, it's not that it didn't arise. It's not that people didn't actually bring up the possibility. There were numerous religious reformers who did propose a monotheistic system. It's just that when it was proposed, it was rejected, sometimes violently so. And the reason for that has to do with everything that we've been talking about all this time, which is that while we as human beings are perfectly comfortable with contradictory and conflicting attributes within ourselves, we are not so comfortable with contradictory and conflicting attitudes in God. And so we are much more comfortable having a different God for each one of our attributes, right? A God of love and a God of war and a God of the sky and a God of the earth and a father deity and a mother deity. We want all those things spread out. When someone says, no, all those things exist in a single God, the ancient mind doesn't get it. Why? Why would one God be both good and evil? Why would one God be responsible for darkness and light? It doesn't compute. And so one of the many conflicts that arose, once monotheism started to stick, if you will, is, well, hold on a second. How then do we explain creation? Because if there was God and God created the world, what did he create the world from, if not from himself? And if he created the world from himself, doesn't that violate the nature of God as indivisible? And so the only possible response to that is that creation is God. That however you define all of this, that it is inextricable from God. And Luria's way of explaining this is he coined a term that essentially means like contraction. That's the best, right? Contraction. And what he said was, what God did was that he contracted his Ein Sof, right? His infinite light. He contracted it. And in contracting it, made space, made conceptual space for creation to arise. Now, just to be clear, philosophers have a different word for that view. They call it panentheism instead of pantheism. It's just a little, just to show that the difference there being that, the idea is that God is the universe, but is also above the universe, as opposed to pantheism, which just says God is the universe. But panentheism is just another form of pantheism. It exists in Judaism very profoundly. It exists in Christianity. It certainly exists in Islam and in the Sufi traditions. It exists in Taoism and Buddhism and Hinduism. It exists in philosophy. Actually, the term pantheism is not just a religious term, it's a philosophical term. The great philosopher Spinoza was one of the first to talk about this notion of monism, right? The idea of all things being irreducible to one thing in philosophy. It exists in science, in the very concept of the preservation of energy and matter. The idea that whatever exists now has always existed and will always exist as long as the universe exists. That's a scientific fact. And even there, scientists tend to call it panpsychism. They don't use the word pantheism. So they don't say all is God. They say all is psyche, meaning all is mind or all is consciousness. But again, those are just words. They're just words for the same idea. And I think what I want to do with this book, it's unusual. It's not like the other books that I've written, because this one has a very personal bend to it. It's the first time that I'm actually saying, this is what I believe, and it would be cool if other people believed it too. But that is ultimately what I want to do. A British newspaper, The Spectator, accused me of wanting to start my own religion, and said that, give Reza Aslan 10 years and he'll be wearing a turban and flying his own private jet. And I was like...
Tempting.
Yes, that doesn't sound too bad, actually.
So a lot of aspects of your career have led you to interview people who identify as religious, right? I want to know, when you have those encounters, what are you most curious about? And is there anything, you got a rabbi sitting in front of you, is there anything that you want to ask me?
You know, what I've noticed in the conversations that I have with religious people is usually twofold. One, that the metaphors that they use to express their religion ultimately express what seems to me a very similar faith experience, right? The questions that they ask, the way that they ask them, it's just that they use, as we've been talking about all along, like a different language. So it's sort of like the equivalent of hearing someone suddenly speak, French or German, and you need a translator, right? You need someone to tell you exactly what is being said. And once that translation starts, then it's not just that you're understanding, it's that you're connecting, right? You're actually having a dialogue back and forth. And so that's the first thing that I notice. And the second thing that I noticed is that they almost always confuse the metaphor for the thing itself. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Where when you point out, I believe something very similar to that, and this is how I describe it. And the response is often, no, that's not the same thing.
Right.
It's not the same thing because your metaphor is different than my metaphor. Right. And so therefore it's not the same thing. I noticed that, the spiritual conversations that I have that are the most rewarding often are with, this new sort of category of Americans who refer to themselves as the nons, right? The non-affiliated. It's basically a way of saying I'm spiritual but not religious. But it's
by the way, Jews have been pioneering that for years.
Yeah, it's an old idea. Yeah. Well, interestingly, so the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, which has been mapping American spirituality for decades, had to actually come up with this new category only about 10 years ago, because of the fact that a lot of people were turning in their questionnaires blank and just sort of simply refusing to choose, which category they were going to, even though there is a category on that list that says atheist and another category that says agnostic. And they would turn it in and say, none of this matches what I am. And so they had to come up with this new category. And the category that they chose was titled non-affiliated. And that's just kind of become known as non or the nons. And in the 2016 Pew study, 24% of Americans chose non. It's the fastest growing label. And I think it tells you something about where we are as a nation, and partly I believe it has to do with the marriage of religion and politics in America over the last 10 years. I don't think it's a coincidence that those two things have risen in tandem with each other. But I find that they are the most rewarding to speak to for this reason, because the metaphors don't get in the way.
Interesting. So my last question before I start to get to some of these audience questions, and these are great so far, so I'm going to regret in advance that I'm not going to be able to get to all of these. I come at God in a very similar way that you do. And one of the struggles that I have in understanding this deep sense of connectedness and not separating creator from creation and removing the emphasis on reward and punishment is this big looming question of morality, right? And this concept of God seems to leave morality in the hands of us as very imperfect beings. Is that your read too? And if so, how do you grapple with that? And where does morality fit into this conversation of religion?
Yeah, and I actually address this at the end of the book, because I do think it's a large part why the pantheistic conception of God isn't very popular. I think partly it has to do with the fact that when you dehumanize God, it makes it that much harder to form a kind of personal relationship with them. It's much easier to think of God as just some dude you met on the street. And so, and have that conversation. Hey, you're just like me. Let's talk. Let's connect. God is not just like you. And no offense to anyone, but God's not just like you. And then the second thing is exactly that. Well, but if God isn't punishing my misdeeds and rewarding my good deeds, then why should I even have good deeds or misdeeds? Now, what I find interesting is that oftentimes the people who ask that question tend to be very sort of conservative religious people, be they, devout Christians or, ultra-Orthodox Jews or, fundamentalist Muslims. Those are the people who I think most often trip over this notion. And honestly, more than anything, it just depresses me. It really depresses me to think that, your moral behavior towards other people and towards your world is predicated on getting a reward at the end of this thing. Like you're some kid who gets a lollipop for not crying while getting a haircut, Like how immature and childish are we as spiritual beings that that's what we need? At the same time, I get it. And so part of my argument for pantheism, as I was kind of saying a little bit before, is that if you remove that aspect of the divine and instead infuse everything with the divine, then it still prohibits you. If you're a devout believer, it still prohibits you from acting immorally to other people and to the world, because doing so is acting immorally toward God. So if you're taking this God thing seriously at all, instead of thinking of it as some prize that you get when it's all over, instead think about this as your relationship with God. And I get it. I get that it's a different way of thinking, but that's why I think that it is a deeper spirituality.
The closest experience I've ever had to religious epiphany was my third year of rabbinic school, happening upon the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who gives us this idea that commandment comes through the face of the other. And it was just an aha for me, because right? I never related. Torah is beautiful and valuable, and it's there for me to mine for wisdom, but it didn't come with that sense of commandedness of reward and punishment, and these are the things you have to follow. But this idea that commandment comes through the fact that I am forced to face your existence, right? And you have a claim over me. That was something that was just really profound.
That's perfectly put.
So, okay, I've got a lot of these. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to try to do these as rapid fire as you possibly can.
I'm a talker. It's what I do.
Okay?
I can't,
Do you plan to take this book to speak to red states out of New York City and LA? Do you suggest we tackle this? I'm not sure what this is. 62% of Americans who don't know a Muslim. And
I think it's actually higher than that, but yes, I'm traveling the entire country. I just came from Georgia, and I'm off to Texas. And I do. People ask me all the time about the audiences that I talk to, and for the most part, to be honest with you, I don't really think about it. Partly it's just because, I'm not a details guy. And somebody gives me a list and says, you're in Alabama tomorrow. And it's like, I guess I'm in Alabama tomorrow. And then I'm not clever enough to think of something new to say, so I'll just say the same thing over and over again. And people there are people who react negatively. There's no question about that. But I think the one thing that inoculates me slightly is that I take faith seriously. I don't denigrate people's faith. This is kind of the foundation of who I am. If I actually do believe that religion is just different languages for expressing the similar faith, then I'm okay with, the different languages that people bombard me with, and I'm perfectly fine sort of meeting them where they are. It doesn't bother me.
So that leads us to the next question. So why be a believer as a Muslim? Why not be a more generic spiritual?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And you can be sort of, generically spiritual. I think it's a very rare thing. Again, going back to the nones, there have been an enormous amount of study done on the nones, the people who say that they are of no religious identity, but they are spiritual, that when they are forced to actually describe their spirituality, immediately revert to the comfortable metaphors and symbols, usually the ones that they grew up in. When you want to think about or talk about such a thing as faith, you do just kind of immediately revert to the metaphors that you've been taught, the metaphors that you grew up in. I chose my metaphors, and I chose them because, it goes back to something that the Buddha said that has become kind of a mantra for me. The Buddha said that if you want to strike water, you don't dig 6 1-foot wells, you dig 1 6-foot well. And Islam is my 6-foot well. But again, the important point there is that the Buddha was making it very clear that no matter what well you are using, the water is the same.
The water you're going to get to. Have you had a religious experience involving an altered state of consciousness? And if so, can you share a few words about it?
Yes, I've had a few in my life. I had a number in my Christian years. You're particularly in my Christianity. It's a Christianity that's very, very cosmic, right? Evangelical Christianity is all about good versus evil, light versus darkness, and which side are you on, kind of a thing, and that there's a spiritual battle, that you're nothing more than pawns on this earth, that the things that we do have cosmic consequences, and that mindset, I think, naturally foments certain metaphysical, transcendental experiences that are very real. But I think as I've gotten older, the majority of my metaphysical experiences come through my family. I once said that my family is my church, and I mean that. First of all, I mean that quite literally. My family literally gets together on Sunday. It's just my family, and we have our own little thing that we call home church. But it also is the source of my spiritual connection. It's where I feel closest to God, however that is being defined.
So I've got a couple questions here that I'm going to butcher in order to combine, but they're pointing to this idea of monotheism and patriarchy, right? Or hierarchy, and those structures being particularly linked. So I'm just going to throw that out, that connection to you for you to comment on. Yeah,
easy. Let me take you on a very, very brief, 20, 30,000 year history of human spirit. It's going to be very, very brief, okay? When we were hunter-gatherers, primarily our gods were the gods of the sky, because what was important at that point was geography, landscape. And so the way that we understood our connection with the deities was through those aspects of nature that helped in the hunt. And most of those deities were male deities. With some exception, the moon is often seen as a female deity. Not always, but it's often seen as a female deity. But the sun is most definitely a male deity. The sky is a male deity. Thunder, lightning, these are male deities. When we transitioned to agriculture, interestingly enough, our focus went from the sky to the earth. Now, the earth, as opposed to the sky, is associated with female deities. Obviously, right? It gives us life. We plant seeds in it. It sprouts life. We live off of it. The fertility of women became divinized in a way. But then something very interesting happened, which is that with agriculture came the rise of civilizations. And with civilization came the creation of organized religion, right? Religion, like was not stable. It was not static. It was in constant movement. But when we stopped moving and we settled down and we began to plant fields and build villages and cities, we also built temples, a place to house the gods. And here's the thing about temples, is that the second you build something like that, you need someone to administer it, right? You need someone who's in charge of that thing now. And that the idea of the intermediary between humanity and God almost always fell to men. There were exceptions, particularly in Mesopotamia, when you have like very, very powerful goddesses, like Inanna, or as we know her, Ishtar. Those kinds of goddesses who were extraordinarily powerful would have women in charge of them. But even that was a patriarchal thing, because the idea was that, well, the goddess is a woman, and so it requires women to take care of her, But the other gods, those are all just male dominated. And so that is the process whereby what we start to see is the creation of organized religion almost immediately becomes a patriarchal thing. And that just extends for the next, 10, 12,000 years. It's sort of an unbroken chain that can really go back to the very first civilizations and the very first temples that we built.
So do you think that the threading back in of pantheism or panentheism from those earliest days will start to shift that patriarchy?
Most definitely, because it's not a coincidence that particularly once we start morphing into monotheistic systems, the monotheistic God is always conceived of in male terms. And so as a result, I think the idea is that, well, then men should be in charge of this thing. But if you de-gender God, if you think of God, as an it instead of a he or a she, then yes, absolutely, it fosters, I think, lesser patriarchal control over religious institutions.
Okay. You said God does not hate people, you hate gay people, right? But we are born into a religion which has ideas that predate us. For religious Jews, for example, even though we may not hate gay people, we may still want to exclude gay relationships. And not because we hate gay people, but because it's in Scripture and we believe in the divinity of Scripture. Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile those things? Or
I guess what I will say is that I assume that the person who believes in the divinity of Scripture, when it comes to issues of homosexuality, also believes in the divinity of Scripture when it commands us to take our disobedient children to the outskirts of town and stone them to death. So if you do that, then I accept your interpretation of the divinity of Scripture. But until you accept that part too. See, this is I'm joking, obviously, but it's remarkable how selective we are when it comes to what parts of the Scripture we choose to read literally, and what parts we say, well, but that's historical context. That's just, that's a cultural thing. That's how they did it then. We're not going to stone our children today when they disobey us. Okay, so historical context there, but not historical context here. If you're going to pick and choose, fine, pick and choose. We all pick and choose. Everybody picks and chooses. But at least admit that you're picking and choosing.
Does God love Kevin Spacey?
I'm going to take a hard pass on that question. I don't want to go, just in case anybody is recording anything, I know that whatever I say is not going to come out right.
I think this one is more personally to you as Reza, a believing Muslim, rather than Reza as a scholar. Are there Muslims spearheading a reformation?
Okay, so I'm going to be an academic here and first define terms, right? So we can't say God until we define God. Can't say Reformation until you define Reformation. Reformation is not what you think it is. Okay, I think because we live in Protestant America, we have a skewed view of what Reformation is. Reformation is a universal phenomenon that takes place in all great religious traditions when institutions and individuals begin to fight over who has the authority to define the faith, to define the scripture. The Jewish Reformation is what we refer to as rabbinical Judaism, the process whereby authority for the meaning and message of the Jewish faith was wrested from the temple priests by scholars and individuals, rabbis, who wanted to interpret the faith on their own. Now that process was accelerated by the destruction of the temple, but that's what that means. The Christian Reformation wasn't between Catholic intransigence and Protestant reform, and by golly, the Protestants won. That's not what happened. This was an argument between the institution, in this case, the papacy, and individuals over which one of them gets to define the fate. And in both of those cases, the result of that argument was violence, often catastrophically so. The Christian Reformation resulted in the death of half the population of Germany alone. The Islamic Reformation has been going on for more than almost 100 years now, and you're just not paying attention to it. I think people look at the violence taking place in large parts of the Muslim world and say, what they need is a reformation. The violence is the reformation. You're watching it before your very eyes. This dramatic global fight over who gets to interpret this thing. Is it going to be the institutions of Islam, the traditional schools of law, the traditional ulama who have maintained for the last 1400 years an iron grip over the meaning and message of Islam, primarily because they're the only ones who could read the Quran. They're the only ones who had access to the Quran. Or is it going to be individuals who are going to seize for themselves this power to interpret the text as they see fit? Now, as we all know, when you say that the interpretation of a sacred text rests in the hands of individuals, not the institution, you are opening up a can of worms, because that means any individual now has the power of an imam, or the power of a priest, or the power of a rabbi. Any individual can go to the text and define for themselves what the text means. And so you're going to have individualistic interpretations that promote peace and tolerance and pluralism, and you're going to have individual interpretations that foster violence and autocracy and bigotry. And, there is no Muslim pope, so nobody gets to say who's right and who's wrong. And so the result of this is this gigantic clash over who gets to decide. I mean, I don't want to sound, heretical here, but probably one of the most significant leaders of the Islamic Reformation, the man that we'll probably look at 100 years from now as playing a pivotal role in the Reformation, is Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden's argument, which was so profoundly popular, was, and you read this in his writings all the time, stop going to mosque. Stop going to your mosque. Stop listening to your imam. Don't pay any attention to Al-Azhar. Ignore the Saudi clerics. They have nothing for you. Instead, go to the text yourself. Examine the text for yourself, and you will see that it compels you to act in these certain ways. And it was by setting himself up as an alternative source of authority, despite the fact that he has not had a single day of instruction in the Islamic sciences. He's an engineer. He has no degrees in the Quran. He's never studied Islam or Islamic law, but that's where his power came from. In fact, the argument was even more succinct than that. The argument was that it doesn't matter what the ulama have to say. The very fact that they say it from a position of learned authority negates their position altogether. And that's why, the leaders of his movement were doctors and engineers and sociologists. They weren't imams. They weren't, scholars or religious leaders. That's not who they wanted. And again, I think if you understand what the argument is and what's at stake, then suddenly things become clear. Stop talking about, a reformation, and stop recognizing the Reformation that you are living through.
I've got a couple questions here that are framing secularism as kind of a foregone conclusion, or in one case as a challenge. Can you speak a little bit more about the nons and about their relationship to religiosity and what that implies about the future of religion?
Well, first, let's define terms.
Yep.
So there's a difference between secularism and secularization. So we are not a secular country in the United States, far, far from it. We are a secularized country in the United States. Secularism is an ideology that says religion has no place in the public realm, that religion is a private thing and it should not be part of, the public realm. France is a secular country. Secularization is the process whereby political authority rests in civic leaders and not religious leaders, right? That's the whole idea of the separation of church and state and the anti-establishment clause and all of that stuff, that we do not allow for our religious leaders to have political authority, like, for instance, in Iran. So the reason I make that distinction is I think sometimes people think that secularism is a necessity for modern societies, that secularism is a necessity for democracy. And that's not true at all. I mean, you can be a religious country and still be democratic as long as you maintain adherence to the principles of democracy. Chief among them is the equal rights for all people, regardless of their faith, regardless of their race or their ethnicity or gender. But the idea that the laws and values of a nation can be predicated on a particular religious morality, well, that's called America. That's what we do here. So what I would say is, I think as the nons start to become a greater force in society, funny story, last week the very first elected federal representative in history came out as a non. And it was like a big deal. Like they acted like he was coming out of the closet or something, right? He literally was like a House of Representatives, a congressman who was like, I'm not sure I believe in God. And that was like the Washington Post wrote an article about it, right? Like that's the kind of country that we are. So I think that as the nones, become a greater social and political force, what you're going to see is less of specific religious influences on society, but I don't think that you're going to suddenly see the kind of secularism that we see in countries like France or in countries like Egypt. And yes, Egypt is a secular country. Egypt is a country in which religious expressions in the political realm are responded to with profound violence. I mean, if you're running for president in America and you stand up in front of thousands of people and say, as Mike Huckabee famously said when he was running for president, that as president, I will change the Constitution so that it is in better alignment with the Bible. That was his Trump. That was his Trump. That was his. Oops. That was his stump speech. You know what we say? Okay, well, let's vote on whether we agree with that or not. If you're a politician in Egypt and you stand up in front of thousands of people and say, I want to change the Constitution so that it is in better alignment with the Quran, you will never be heard from again. You will just simply disappear and no one will see you again. So yeah, Egypt is a secular country.
What is the best way to make people cognizant of the fact that they humanize God and the dangers of doing so? And do you think that our innate desire to humanize God will grow stronger with our advances in science and technology or diminish?
Oh, great question. So the first part I kind of already said, which is just simply ask someone to describe God. Just ask them, Don't say, do you believe in God or not? Just say, describe God to me. Describe what you mean by God. And then point out to them that basically everything that they said is just a description of like a really powerful human being, like a human being but with superhuman powers. And they recognize it themselves. And then secondly, I think the opposite. I actually think, and I've written a little bit about this, but it's something that I firmly believe. I think that, oftentimes in our conversations about religion and science, we tend to believe that these are diametrically opposed things that are, diverging from each other. First of all, they're not diametrically opposed. They're in many ways just sort of two different modes of knowing, two different ways of approaching the fundamental questions of reality and existence. And they don't necessarily need to be in conflict with each other. Secondly, I think that what you're seeing now is the slow convergence of religion and science. In many ways, the more science begins to ask these fundamental questions about the nature of reality, right? Not just about the laws of physics, but about, concepts such as proto-consciousness and the sort of the issues like panpsychism that we were talking about. The more scientists start to use language that, at least to me, sounds like some 16th century mystic, and the way that they talk about these ideas. And so I think probably what we are going to see is a time in the, not too distant future in which these two things, science and religion, increasingly begin to use the same kinds of terms, the same kinds of language. For those of you who think that, eventually science will just continue to make discoveries, and with each discovery, religion will go away. I don't think you really understand religion. I mean, when we discovered that the earth was not the center of the universe, it's not like Christianity went away. It's not like the Pope was like, oh, my bad, never mind. No. Christians just absorbed that information and moved on. If aliens suddenly show up, from some distant planet and walk out and are, just like, take me to your leader. First of all, we would say no. No, we're not. You don't want to meet our leader. Trust us. It's just better. It's better if it's just like this. And then secondly, we would just simply absorb that information in our religions and move on. Scientific discoveries do not diminish religion. Religion just absorbs those discoveries and keeps going. So I think, honestly, that's where I would say we're headed, is towards a convergence of these two things. I think in the future, religion is going to look a lot more like science than we think it will. And science is going to look a lot more like religion.
So in your book, you say there's no evidence that Moses ever existed. If he never existed, when was the concept of the character Moses created? And I'm going to add on to this question. Can you just speak a little bit about the nature of Scripture, right? And
Right.
how it incorporates some of these things that don't have archaeological evidence or facts behind them?
Right.
How do those things come into being?
Well, so just first a correction. So I don't say that there's no evidence that Moses ever existed. I mean, the problem is that when you're talking about that far back in history, the idea that you could actually pinpoint the existence of an individual is impossible. There is no evidence that Jesus existed, and that's, almost 1,000 years later. So I think it's important to understand that we're not talking about individuals, we are talking about certain narratives. And yes, it's true that there has never been any archaeological evidence to show the existence of Israelites in Egypt or the existence of a massive exodus of Israelites across the Sinai. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't find something one day. But we just have never found any, and there's been a lot of looking, as you can imagine. We just haven't found any. But I think you bring up a much more important point here, one that we touched on slightly, and that is this idea of Scripture being understood as either truth or fact, right? We, as products of the scientific age, have been taught that which is true is that which can be factually verified. And so we want that same idea of truth from our scriptures without recognizing that the people who composed these scriptures had a completely different understanding of the concept of truth. That for them, truth and fact were two totally different things, and that the facts of a story are far less important than the truth that is conveyed in that story. And I think, again, that we would be better off, that we would have a more meaningful spirituality, that we would be actually reading the scriptures in the way that it was intended if we also understood that truth and fact are two different things, and that if we read our scriptures more interested in truth than we are in fact.
Almost a scriptural originalist rather than a literalist.
That's good. I'm actually going to steal that.
You're welcome. Last question. The Dalai Lama co-wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that seemed to say his belief system had evolved beyond religion to a belief in a secular ethics or morality. Is this what you have concluded as well, or are you on a pathway to that?
Look, if I were to describe my ethics and my morality, I think I would describe it in the same way. That my ethics and morality are not predicated on what I think God does or does not want me to do to my fellow human beings and to my fellow, creation. My ethics and morality are predicated on this idea that I have certain responsibilities to creation and to my fellow human beings, responsibilities that in my case come from the idea that I do see the divine in them, but I don't necessarily need to see that in order to understand that there are proper moral and ethic ways of behaving in the world that lessen suffering, that lessen pain, that lessen violence, and all of that is a good thing in and of itself. I do think that what's really fascinating about the Dalai Lama and the way that he has been talking recently, and this is perhaps for another time, so I won't get too deep about it, is that, he is preparing the world's Tibetan Buddhists, not just those in Tibet, but those around the world, for essentially the end of that religion. And it's an extraordinary thing to watch. Those of you who are unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, the Dalai Lama has announced that he will not be resurrecting. He will not be reincarnating, I should say. He will not be reincarnating. That there will be no Dalai Lama after him. And just so we're on the same page here, the Dalai Lama is the reincarnation of a bodhisattva called Avalokiteshvara. And this bodhisattva is an enlightened being who, thousands of years ago, decided that rather than getting off the wheel of rebirth and going into nirvana, even though she, and the Avalokiteshvara is a woman, even though she has the ability, she had the ability to do so, that she would continue to reincarnate over and over and over again until she had finally provided that same nirvana to all of humanity. The politics of the situation has created a situation in which China has said that it will decide who the next Dalai Lama is, and it has actually demanded that the Dalai Lama reincarnate. It has officially demanded it. And the Dalai Lama's response to that has been to say no, that this is it. I'm essentially gonna go. I'm gonna go to nirvana and leave you all behind. Yeah, I know. It's honestly, the people like me who live for this kind of stuff are just we don't know how to process this. Religions die all the time. Religions go away all the time.
Yeah, but they don't intentionally sunset.
They don't intentionally die because the divine figure says, it's all over, everybody. Go back to your homes. It's all over. And this has caused this real conflict in the heart of Tibetan Buddhism. Many Tibetan Buddhists are rejecting the Dalai Lama's, not just his statement, but now are rejecting the Dalai Lama. Even juicier, they're being led by the Dalai Lama's younger brother, which is so fantastic that it's also a family thing. Again, to me, when I see things like that, this is why it's all so fascinating, right? Religion isn't just about, the things that a person believes. It has these profound social and political and even global aspects to it. And part of the reason why we do need to be religiously literate, why I do the kinds of things that I do, is because you can't avoid it. You can't avoid religion. And you need to be aware of it, and you need to be learned in it, because it will help you navigate the craziness that is the world that we live in.
So what a wonderful note to end on. And I'll just say, I'm a rabbi. I do religion for a living, as do you, in a different way. I haven't gotten to talk about God this much, I think, in the last 5 years in one sitting. And it's really a joy. And I think that sometimes, our community needs external catalysts to have the opportunity to reflect on ourselves. So I want to thank you. And I think we all want to thank him for providing us with that opportunity.
Thank you. It's been a great honor to be here. Thank you.
So, for those of you who do have books, Reza will be in our chapel for book signing until 9:15 sharp. And we have some cookies and tea for you to enjoy outside. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, everyone. That was so great.
C-SPAN, where history unfolds daily. In 1979, C-SPAN was created as a public service by American